Snow drifts gently over a quiet mountain town. A lone street lamp glows through the falling white, and beneath it, a little girl kneels in the snow, clutching a baby wrapped in a thin gray blanket. Her lips are blue from the cold, but her voice is steady as she whispers, "Candy for $1, sir. My brother can't breathe." A patrol car slows nearby. Inside, a weary police officer grips the steering wheel, his eyes catching the fragile scene through the frost. Beside him, a German shepherd lifts its head, ears pricking, sensing something more than duty. A call from the heart. Before the story begins, I want to ask you, where are you watching from today? Tell me in the comments below, and may your day be filled with warmth, peace, and a small miracle of your own. Snow blanketed the quiet streets of Maple Hollow, a small mountain town tucked deep within the Blue Ridge Range. Street lamps glowed through the falling flakes like distant candles, their halos trembling in the mist. The night was silent, except for the hum of tires cutting through slush. Officer Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel of his patrol SUV, his breath faintly fogging the glass as the heater struggled against the biting cold. He was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with gray-blue eyes that carried the calm of a man who had seen too much to be easily shaken. His brown hair, once thick, was trimmed short now, streaked with the faint silver of sleepless years. Beneath his uniform jacket he wore a wool sweater, and beneath that, a chest that still bore the faint scar of an old gunshot wound, a memory from his time in the city force before Maple Hollow became his refuge. Ethan was not a man of many words. The job had taught him silence could be more powerful than speech. But he had a soft spot for the lost, especially since his wife Grace had died from pneumonia 5 winters ago while he was working a double shift. That loss had left him quieter, gentler perhaps, but lonelier too. Beside him sat Valor, his German shepherd partner. The dog was 5 years old, with a thick black and tan coat dusted now with snowflakes that melted as soon as they touched. His amber eyes reflected intelligence and loyalty, and a scar ran along his right ear, a reminder of a chase gone wrong 2 years earlier. Valor had been trained as a K-9 in the city, and like Ethan, he had been transferred to Maple Hollow after losing his first handler in a shootout. Together, they were two souls scarred by loss, finding meaning in serving again. Ethan often joked that Valor understood grief better than most people. The dog seemed to sense when to nudge his arm during moments of silence or sit close when Ethan's eyes drifted toward old photographs. The radio crackled faintly, dispatch reporting a quiet shift, no emergencies. Ethan reached for his thermos, took a sip of lukewarm coffee, and glanced at the clock. 11:42 p.m. "Let's finish the loop, buddy," he murmured, and Valor's ears perked. The SUV rolled past shuttered shops, their holiday lights dimmed, until it slowed at the intersection of Birch Avenue and Main. That's when Ethan saw her. Under a flickering street lamp sat a little girl, knees pulled to her chest, her small frame trembling beneath a thin pink coat that was far too small for her. Snow clung to her hair like frozen petals, her cheeks red and raw from the wind. A cardboard box sat beside her, filled with lollipops wrapped in faded plastic. In her arms, she cradled a bundled baby wrapped in an old gray blanket. The baby's face was pale, his breath shallow and uneven, steam barely visible from his lips. Ethan's heart clenched. He parked, stepping out into the cold. The air bit at his face as he approached. Valor followed close behind, tail lowered, sensing something fragile in the air. "Hey there, sweetheart," Ethan said softly, kneeling a few feet away. "What are you doing out here so late?" The girl looked up. Her eyes were wide and glassy, the color of melted chocolate. "Candy for $1, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, we need medicine. My baby brother can't breathe." Ethan froze mid-step. The words pierced through the armor of his composure. He took in her trembling hands, the purple tint on her lips, and the way she clutched the baby as though her arms alone could keep him alive. "How long have you been here?" he asked gently. "Since after dinner," she whispered. "No one stops when it snows." Her voice carried neither anger nor complaint, just quiet exhaustion, the kind that should never belong to a child. Ethan removed his gloves, crouched beside her, and felt the baby's forehead. It burned with fever. He looked up at Valor, who whined softly, his amber eyes fixed on the infant. "Okay," Ethan said finally, keeping his tone calm. "Let's get him somewhere warm, all right? What's your name?" "Sophie," she said. "He's Noah." "I'm Officer Cole, and this is Valor. We're going to help you, Sophie." He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame completely. "Come on," he said, lifting Noah carefully. The baby's breathing rasped faintly, a fragile sound in the frozen silence. Sophie hesitated, her bare feet pressing into the snow, then followed close, clutching the edge of the coat like a lifeline. Inside the SUV, Ethan cranked up the heater. Valor hopped into the back seat, curling protectively near the baby's feet. Sophie stared at him with wonder. "He's big," she whispered. "Yeah," Ethan smiled faintly. "But he's gentle." Valor licked his nose, earning a faint giggle from her, a sound so small it felt like the first breath of spring in the dead of winter. As the car sped toward the hospital, Ethan spoke softly. "Sophie, where are your parents?" She hesitated. "Mom got sick last week. She couldn't get up anymore. I went to find help, but when I came back, she wasn't breathing." Her voice cracked. "We don't have anyone else." Ethan's throat tightened. The image of Grace lying in the hospital bed years ago flashed before him. He had promised her he'd make it in time, but the storm that night had delayed him. He hadn't forgiven himself since. "You did good, Sophie," he said quietly. "You took care of your brother. That's brave." She looked up at him, confused. "People said brave doesn't matter when you're poor." Ethan's jaw clenched. "They're wrong." At the hospital entrance, the bright red sign of emergency glowed through the snow. Ethan rushed inside, carrying Noah, while Sophie clung to Valor's leash. Nurses turned at once when they saw the scene. "Respiratory distress, infant, severe fever," Ethan called out. The nurses took Noah from his arms and disappeared through the automatic doors. Sophie tried to follow, but Ethan knelt and stopped her gently. "They'll take care of him," he said softly. Her small hands trembled as she looked up. "You promise?" He hesitated only a second, then nodded. "I promise." A nurse named Mara, in her late 40s, approached. She was short, with sandy hair tied tightly under her cap, and lines of kindness around her eyes. "You did the right thing bringing them," she said, glancing at Ethan's badge. "He's in good hands now." She turned to Sophie. "Let's get you warm, honey." Sophie hesitated, still watching the doors. Valor nudged her hand with his nose, and she looked down at him, startled but comforted. "He's soft," she whispered, petting him gently. Mara smiled. "He likes you?" While the nurse led Sophie to a nearby bench with a blanket, Ethan stood still for a long moment, staring through the glass doors where Noah had disappeared. His breath fogged against the sterile hospital air, and in that haze, he saw a reflection of his past. The night Grace had been rushed to a hospital, much like this one. The night he'd failed to keep his promise. But maybe tonight, he thought, he could finally keep one. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the footprints they had left behind. The town slept quietly, unaware that within these bright walls, a stranger's kindness had begun to melt a heart that had been frozen for years. Valor sat by the waiting room chair, his head resting on Sophie's knee as she whispered softly to him, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Will he be okay?" she murmured, half to the dog, half to herself. Valor made a low sound in his throat, a comforting rumble that seemed almost like an answer. Ethan watched them both, one small child, one loyal dog, curled together in the warmth of the emergency room, and for the first time in years, something within him eased. The world outside was still bitter and white, but here, in this fragile moment, it felt like spring might find a way back. He took a deep breath, sat beside Sophie, and said softly, "You're not alone anymore, kid." And though she didn't answer, her eyes already closing as she drifted into sleep, Ethan knew she had heard him. Somewhere deep down, under the storm and the sorrow, hope had begun to stir again. The snowstorm outside had thickened by the time Officer Ethan Cole returned to the hospital waiting room. Maple Hollow General stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the white night, its emergency lights cutting through the storm's silence. The hum of fluorescent bulbs echoed faintly above, mixing with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping from the rooms beyond. Ethan's uniform was damp from melted snow, his hair tousled, and his eyes shadowed from the fatigue that had long ago become part of his face. Valor, his German shepherd partner, sat obediently at his side, resting his chin on his paws, but keeping his golden eyes alert, as if still on duty. Across from them, little Sophie sat curled on the waiting room bench, Ethan's thick coat still swallowing her small frame. Her bare feet now rested on a folded towel a nurse had provided, and a styrofoam cup of hot cocoa trembled between her hands. She hadn't said a word since Noah had been taken behind those white double doors. The sliding doors hissed open, letting in a gust of snow and a man wrapped in a long charcoal overcoat. He looked around briefly before approaching the reception desk. His name was Dr. Leonard Hart, a man in his mid-50s with silver hair and a calm, deliberate air that spoke of decades spent balancing between exhaustion and empathy. His glasses rested halfway down his nose, and though his eyes looked tired, there was still light behind them, the kind that belonged to those who hadn't yet lost faith in what they did. "Officer Cole?" he asked, scanning the room until his gaze met Ethan's. "You brought in the 2 children?" Ethan stood. "Yes. The boy's name is Noah, around a year old, high fever, shallow breathing. His sister found him struggling to breathe outside." Dr. Hart nodded, his expression grave but steady. "You did the right thing bringing them in. The boy's condition is serious but manageable. We've started him on oxygen and antibiotics. The next 12 hours will be critical." Sophie's head jerked up, eyes wide. "He'll be okay, right?" Her voice was fragile, a single thread holding together hope and fear. Dr. Hart crouched beside her, his voice soft but honest. "He's fighting, sweetheart, and we're helping him fight." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded bravely, clutching Ethan's coat tighter. Dr. Hart straightened and turned to Ethan. "The little one hasn't eaten properly for days. Malnutrition likely, exposure too. The sister's showing mild frostbite on her fingers, but nothing permanent. She'll need food, warmth, and rest." Ethan exhaled slowly, relief and anger mixing inside him. Relief that the children were alive, anger that they had been left to suffer unseen in a town where he thought he knew every street, every soul. "Can I see him?" "In a bit. Let him stabilize first," Dr. Hart said. Then, studying Ethan for a moment, he added, "You look like you could use a warm drink yourself." "I'll be fine." Dr. Hart offered a small, knowing smile. "We always say that." Then he disappeared down the corridor. Ethan sat again, glancing toward Sophie. She had finally loosened her grip on the cup and was staring at Valor, who had lifted his head to watch her. "He's a good boy," Ethan said quietly. "Would you like to pet him?" She hesitated, then reached out, brushing her small fingers over Valor's fur. "He's warm," she whispered. Valor responded by leaning closer, pressing his head against her knee. A nurse walked by, carrying a clipboard. Nurse Elaine Carter, a young woman in her late 20s, with auburn hair tied neatly and freckles across her nose. She had a quick, kind energy that filled any space she entered. "Officer Cole," she said, pausing by his chair. "The little boy's responding well to treatment. His breathing's more stable now." She turned to Sophie with a gentle smile. "You can see him soon, sweetheart." Sophie nodded silently, her lip trembling, relief flooding her expression. Ethan thanked her, but before Elaine could leave, his radio buzzed faintly on his belt. Static broke through, followed by the voice of Sergeant Miller from dispatch. "Cole, status check. You still at General?" "Affirmative," Ethan replied. "Situation under control. 2 minors in medical care." There was a pause, then Miller's gruff tone softened. "Copy that. Take your time, Cole. We'll cover your beat tonight." "Thanks, Sarge." He switched the radio off, rubbing the bridge of his nose. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel, responsibility that went beyond the badge. These children weren't just part of a report. They were part of something fragile and real that now depended on him. Hours passed. The snow outside slowed, leaving soft drifts against the hospital's glowing windows. The waiting room grew quiet. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past, humming softly to himself. A man named Frank, heavy-set with kind eyes and a limp from an old injury. "Poor kids," he muttered, glancing at Sophie. "World's colder than this snow sometimes." Ethan nodded faintly. Yeah, but sometimes it gives second chances. By dawn, Sophie was allowed into Noah's room. The boy looked impossibly small beneath white sheets, a thin oxygen tube beneath his nose. His chest rose and fell rhythmically now, no longer struggling. Ethan stood by the door as Sophie ran to her brother's side. "He's warm again," she whispered, brushing his cheek. Valor lay beside the bed, tail thumping softly against the tile floor. Dr. Hart entered quietly, clipboard in hand. "He'll make it," he said, his voice low but certain. "A few days of rest, and he'll be fine." Sophie turned, her face lighting up like dawn after a long night. "Thank you." Dr. Hart smiled gently. "Thank your officer. He's the one who found you." Sophie looked at Ethan, tears brimming. "You kept your promise." Ethan swallowed hard. "Yeah, I did." Later that morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the frosted glass, Ethan stepped out to call in his report. Valor followed him to the parking lot, paws crunching over the snow. The cold air was sharp, but it smelled clean, alive. Ethan stared at the pale horizon, thinking of Grace. She would have told him this was where he was meant to be, not in an office, not chasing ghosts from his past, but saving something pure. When he returned inside, he found Sophie asleep on the chair beside Noah's bed, her small hand resting on his blanket. Dr. Hart was speaking quietly with Nurse Elaine about finding temporary care through social services. Ethan overheard the words foster placement, and something inside him tensed. He knew how those systems worked, how easily siblings could be separated, how children could disappear between paperwork and policy. As he stood watching them, Dr. Hart noticed his expression. "Officer Cole," he said gently, "if you're worried, I can vouch for their case personally. But unless there's a guardian—" Ethan interrupted softly. "What if I request temporary guardianship until we find their next of kin?" The doctor raised a brow, surprised. "That's unusual, but not impossible." Valor gave a quiet bark, as if seconding the idea. Ethan looked back at Sophie and Noah. "Then that's what I'll do." And as the snow outside began to melt into the morning light, Ethan felt the faint warmth of something returning to his life. Not duty, but purpose. The kind he thought he'd lost with Grace. The kind that made promises mean something again. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, scattering across the floor in fractured squares of pale gold. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving Maple Hollow washed in a strange, peaceful silence. Officer Ethan Cole stood by the window, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He hadn't slept. His eyes were ringed with fatigue, but his posture remained steady, disciplined, contained. Valor, his German shepherd, lay curled beside the hospital bed where Sophie sat, stroking her brother Noah's hand. The boy was awake now, still weak but breathing evenly. His small chest rose and fell with quiet rhythm, and when Sophie whispered to him, he smiled faintly, clutching her finger. Dr. Hart had discharged them that morning, with careful instructions. The hospital could only keep the children so long. Social services would take over by evening. Ethan had nodded when he heard that, but something inside him had already decided otherwise. As he watched Sophie fold the hospital blanket with surprising care, he thought about what Dr. Hart had said the night before, that unless someone stepped forward, the siblings would be placed in temporary care, possibly in separate foster homes. Ethan couldn't shake the thought. He remembered the way Sophie had looked when she asked if Noah would be okay, the way she'd believed him completely when he said, "I promise." Now, that promise had grown into something larger. A woman from child welfare arrived around noon. Mrs. Carla Briggs was in her early 40s, with short blonde hair, glasses, and the kind of weary kindness that comes from years of handling too many broken families. She wore a long tan coat and carried a thick folder pressed to her chest. "Officer Cole," she greeted politely, her voice soft but efficient. "I heard you found these too." Her tone was professional, but her eyes softened as she looked at Sophie holding Noah's hand. "You did a good thing bringing them in." "Thank you," Ethan replied, shaking her hand. "What happens now?" Mrs. Briggs sighed, pushing her glasses higher. "We'll have to place them in the system, at least temporarily. There's a family in the next county who might take them both, but they're at capacity. It's Difficult to keep siblings together these days. Sophie's head snapped up. "We can't be apart," she said quickly, her small voice breaking. "Please, ma'am, we'll be good." Mrs. Briggs's expression softened, but she didn't answer. She looked instead at Ethan, perhaps hoping he would explain. Ethan crouched beside Sophie. "Hey," he said gently, "no one's taking Noah away. You'll stay together. I'll make sure of that." Mrs. Briggs blinked. "Officer Cole, I appreciate your concern, but that's not—" "I already filed the paperwork with Dr. Hart," Ethan interrupted calmly. "Temporary guardianship until a relative is found." The social worker hesitated, caught between surprise and a kind of relief. "That's highly unusual," she murmured, studying him. "You're aware this means full responsibility. Housing, food, schooling, medical oversight." "I'm aware." Valor stood, tail wagging slightly, as if approving his handler's decision. Mrs. Briggs exhaled, closing the folder. "Well," she said finally, "sometimes the right decision isn't the easy one. I'll process the approval today." By afternoon, the hospital released Noah with a bag of medicine and a worn blue blanket that Sophie insisted on keeping. They stepped out into the cold together, Ethan carrying Noah, Sophie holding Valor's leash. The winter air bit at their cheeks, but the sunlight glowed faintly over the snowbanks, making the world look newly washed. Ethan's truck rumbled down quiet back streets until it turned onto a gravel drive lined with pines. His house stood at the edge of town, a modest two-story cabin of dark wood and stone. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the front porch sagged slightly under years of weather, but the windows glowed with warm light. "This is your house?" Sophie asked, awe mixing with hesitation. "It's ours for now," Ethan replied, stepping out and opening the back door. "Come on in." Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and pine wood. A framed photo sat on the mantel, Ethan and his late wife Grace, both smiling under a summer sun. Sophie noticed it, but didn't ask. She sensed somehow that the silence around it was sacred. The kitchen was small, practical, with mismatched mugs and a stack of case reports piled near the phone. Ethan set Noah on the couch and turned up the heater. Valor jumped onto his usual rug near the fireplace, stretching out with a low sigh. Sophie stood by the doorway, unsure whether to remove her shoes. "You can take them off," Ethan said gently. "No rules here except one. Valor gets the warm spot first." That earned the faintest smile from her. The rest of the day passed in a quiet rhythm. Sophie helped Ethan make soup, though her version of helping mostly meant stirring the pot too fast and spilling broth on the counter. She laughed nervously, apologizing, but Ethan only handed her a towel. "Happens to the best of us," he said. She didn't realize it was the first time he'd smiled like that in months. In the evening, a neighbor stopped by. Mrs. Eleanor Givens, a retired teacher in her late 60s, brought over a casserole, because the officer never eats right. She was short and round, her gray hair tied in a bun, and she wore a bright red scarf that looked like it had seen many Christmases. "Oh, bless these children," she gasped when she saw Sophie and Noah. "You didn't tell me you were fostering." "Wasn't exactly planned," Ethan replied with a faint grin. Mrs. Givens turned to Sophie, her voice kind. "Don't you worry, dear. If you need anything, cookies, mittens, or a stern talking to, come to me." Sophie giggled shyly, and even Noah, half asleep, smiled. Later that night, after Mrs. Givens left and the house grew quiet, Ethan tucked Noah into a spare bedroom beside Sophie's. The boy stirred once, then settled back to sleep, breathing softly. Sophie stood by the doorway. "Do we have to go back soon?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a while." She nodded, relief softening her features. "Can we say goodnight to Valor?" Valor lifted his head from the rug, ears twitching. Ethan smiled. "You just did." Sophie giggled, crouching beside the dog and wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Good night, Valor," she whispered. The dog licked her cheek in response, and she laughed, the kind of laughter that made Ethan's chest ache in the best way. When she finally fell asleep, Ethan stayed in the hallway for a long while, listening to the faint sound of their breathing. The house, once hollow, now carried the quiet heartbeat of life again. He sat by the window, looking out at the snowy pines, and thought about the years he had spent alone. Maybe Grace would have approved of what he'd done, Maybe this was the purpose he'd lost when she left. Valor padded over, sitting beside him. Ethan reached down, scratching behind his ear. "You did good, boy," he murmured. "Looks like we're a family again." Valor gave a low, content rumble, resting his head on Ethan's knee. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not harsh or lonely this time, but soft, gentle, and alive. Morning arrived slow and quiet over Maple Hollow, painting the frozen rooftops in shades of silver. The wind carried the faint smell of pine and wood smoke, and the town stirred awake beneath a pale sun. Inside Ethan's cabin, the fire still glowed from the night before. Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug with a pencil and scraps of paper, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Beside her, Valor rested his head on his paws, occasionally glancing up as if to check her progress. On the paper, a child's careful lines took shape, a drawing of a man in a uniform, a big dog, and two children beside a house surrounded by snow. When Ethan emerged from the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs of cocoa, she looked up proudly. "It's us," she said. He crouched beside her, admiring the picture. "You gave me more hair than I deserve," he joked, and she giggled. Noah's soft babbling came from the couch. He was bundled in one of Ethan's old flannel shirts. The sleeves rolled nearly to his shoulders. His cheeks had regained color, his laughter bright and unguarded. Ethan set down the mugs. "You two planning to eat breakfast or just charm Valor all day?" Sophie straightened, pretending to salute. "Yes, sir." She still said sir sometimes, a habit learned from the world she'd survived, where respect could mean safety. As they ate, Ethan turned on the small TV mounted near the kitchen window. Local news played faintly. An anchor's serious voice cut through the static. Authorities continue to investigate a suspected drug operation in the Maple Hollow Industrial District. Several abandoned buildings were found with traces of narcotics distribution. Ethan's fork paused midair. The address mentioned was only 2 blocks from where he'd found Sophie. He turned down the volume, his jaw tightening. Sophie noticed his silence. "That's near where we used to sleep," she said softly. Ethan looked at her. "Do you remember anyone there? People coming and going?" She frowned, thinking. "There were trucks sometimes, and a man with a red scarf. He always yelled at the others." Her voice dropped. "He said the police never come there." Ethan's pulse quickened. A man with a red scarf. That detail rang too clearly. There had been reports of a supplier known on the streets as Red Hank, rumored to use children to move small packages. Ethan forced his tone calm. "You're safe now. You don't need to worry about him." But inside, a slow burn began. Later that afternoon, he left the children in the care of Mrs. Eleanor Givens, his neighbor from across the lane. Eleanor, in her late 60s, was a retired teacher with sharp eyes and a soft heart. Her small frame always seemed wrapped in knitted shawls of impossible colors. "Don't you fret," she told Ethan, waving him off with a dish towel. "I raised 3 boys meaner than coyotes. These 2 will be angels in comparison." Sophie clung to Ethan's sleeve for a moment before letting go. "You'll be back soon?" "Before supper," he promised. Valor stayed close, ready to go. Downtown Maple Hollow looked deceptively peaceful. Brick storefronts, faded Christmas lights still hanging, though it was February. But Ethan knew the undercurrents. A small ring of dealers had started exploiting the town's forgotten corners after a highway expansion rerouted traffic and jobs. He parked near the alley Sophie had described. The snow there was dirty, crusted with tire tracks. He crouched, scanning the ground. Valor sniffed along the edges, his breath clouding in the cold. Suddenly the dog's posture changed, alert, ears forward. He nosed toward a pile of crates and barked once. Ethan drew his flashlight, sweeping the beam behind them. A faint metallic glint, a spent syringe, half buried in ice. Beside it, a crumpled photo. A woman holding a baby. Ethan froze. The baby's blanket was gray, identical to Noah's. He tucked the photo into his pocket, heart pounding. A voice broke the silence. "Cole?" Ethan turned to see Detective Raymond Knox emerging from the alley's far end. Knox was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, his hair slicked back through the wind undid it immediately. He wore a long navy coat and an expression that hovered between cynicism and loyalty. He had transferred from the city the same year as Ethan. Once partners, they now only saw each other when trouble reached beyond small-town jurisdiction. "Heard you've been busy playing foster dad," Knox said with a half-smile. Ethan straightened. "You hear about the narcotics report?" "Yeah. Captain wants us to coordinate. The lab found traces of fentanyl near those storage units. Looks like Red Hank's crew's expanding north." Knox crouched to study the syringe. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "That Sophie's old building was more than just shelter," Ethan said quietly. Knox glanced up sharply. "The girl's involved?" "She's a witness," Ethan corrected. "And she's staying with me, off record." Knox's eyebrows rose, then lowered in something close to approval. "That's a big step, Cole." He stood, brushing snow from his coat. "You always did let your heart outrun your badge." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "And it's saved more lives than paperwork ever did." They moved through the alley together, following Valor's nose to a locked metal door. The dog growled softly. Ethan signaled Knox, who drew his weapon. With a swift kick, Ethan broke the rusted latch. Inside, the dim space smelled of chemicals and mildew. Rows of cardboard boxes lined the walls, labeled with cleaning supply brands that meant nothing. But when Ethan tore one open, packets of powder spilled out. Knox whistled low. "That's not detergent." Before they could inspect further, a sound echoed from the back. Footsteps, quick and light. "Police!" Ethan shouted, but the figure bolted through a rear exit. Valor lunged forward, barking fiercely. Ethan followed into the snow-choked alley beyond, catching only a glimpse of a red scarf disappearing into the distance. The suspect dove into a truck, tires screeching as it sped away. Ethan fired one warning shot into the air, but the vehicle vanished around the corner. He lowered his gun slowly, breath visible in the icy air. Knox caught up beside him, panting. "Red Hank himself?" Ethan shook his head. "Too short. Maybe one of his runners." He looked down at Valor, who was still growling softly. "We're close." By the time Ethan returned home, twilight had settled over the pines. The cabin windows glowed warmly against the gathering dark. Inside, Mrs. Gibbons was telling Sophie and Noah a story about a snowman who wanted to live forever. The children laughed, their voices bright. When Ethan stepped in, Sophie ran to him. "You came back," she said, relief flooding her face. He smiled faintly. "Told you I would." Mrs. Gibbons gathered her shawl. "They've been angels. The little one loves mashed potatoes. I'll leave you some pie." She winked and shuffled out. After supper, when the children were asleep, Ethan sat by the fire with Valor at his feet. He took the photo from his pocket. The woman and the baby. The woman's face was young, but tired, her smile uncertain. Sophie's mother, he realized. The background showed the same cracked window he'd seen in the abandoned building. She had been there, alive, not so long ago. Maybe she'd been forced into something she couldn't escape. Maybe the same people who used that building had taken everything from her children. Ethan's gaze hardened. He looked at Valor, who lifted his head. "We're not done, boy," he whispered. "Not till we know what really happened." Outside, wind swept across the frozen trees. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, faint, lonely, and far too late. Snow had begun to fall again over Maple Hollow, thick and silent, muffling the world in its slow descent. The town looked peaceful from afar, a cluster of rooftops tucked between the hills. But peace, Ethan Cole knew, was often just a disguise. He stood outside the police precinct, watching his breath mist in the cold air. Valor waited beside him, leash in hand, his black and tan coat dusted with flakes. The dog's amber eyes scanned the street with alert focus, as if sensing what the day would bring. Ethan adjusted the collar of his jacket, the weight of decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. Inside, the precinct buzzed with low conversation and the smell of stale coffee. Detective Raymond Knox sat at a table spread with maps and photos. "You're early," Knox said without looking up. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised. You always were the Boy Scout type." Ethan set his gloves on the table. "We don't have time for jokes, Ray. If Red Hank's moving product through that warehouse, we go tonight before the storm seals the roads." Knox nodded, rubbing his temple. "The captain approved the raid an hour ago. SWAT's coming in from Franklin County. You, me, and Valor will handle entry on the east side." A woman approached from the far desk. Sergeant Laura Briggs, new to Maple Hollow's force, mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She carried herself with quiet authority, the kind that came from surviving more than a few bad nights. Her hazel eyes were sharp but kind, her uniform crisp. She handed Ethan a file. Updated floor plans. Intel says the lower storage area connects to the sewer line. They might use it as an escape route. Ethan thanked her. "You'll stay at headquarters?" She nodded. "Radio lines open. Just don't make me regret approving that dog on the team." Valor wagged his tail, earning a faint smile from her before she turned away. That night, the storm rolled back in, wind howling through the pines as the convoy of dark SUVs crawled down the icy road toward the industrial district. The world was shades of gray, snow, concrete, steel, blending into one another until only movement gave life to the landscape. Ethan sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, helmet resting on his knee. Knox drove, jaw tight. "You sure about bringing Valor in there?" Ethan glanced at the dog sitting alert in the back seat. "He's saved my life more times than I can count." Knox shrugged. "Just keep him close. These people don't hesitate to shoot." The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the storm, its windows blacked out, a single light flickering near the loading dock. Ethan's hand went instinctively to his sidearm. "No sound until breach," he whispered. The team spread out, moving like shadows through the falling snow. Valor trotted silently beside him, nose twitching. At the far end, Ethan caught sight of a red scarf hanging from a hook near the door. His pulse quickened. "He's here," he murmured. Knox counted down on his fingers. 3, 2, 1. The battering ram hit the door with a metallic crash. "Police! Hands where I can see them!" Flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating figures scattering behind stacks of crates. Gunfire erupted, short, sharp bursts echoing through the concrete. Valor barked, lunging forward as Ethan moved between cover, his flashlight catching the blur of movement near the back stairs. "Go, Valor!" The dog sprinted, muscles rippling under his coat, tackling a man who had raised a pistol toward Knox. The suspect fell, weapons skidding across the floor. Ethan caught up, cuffing him swiftly. The man was thin, pale, barely in his 20s, trembling under the weight of adrenaline and fear. "Where's Red Hank?" Ethan demanded. The suspect hesitated, then nodded toward the basement stairs. "Down there. But he's not alone." The team regrouped, descending cautiously. The air grew colder, heavy with chemical fumes. The basement stretched into narrow corridors stacked with barrels and boxes. At the far end, a man in a red scarf stood loading a duffel bag. He was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, his face scarred and unshaven, the kind of man who had seen the inside of too many prisons and not enough daylight. "Evening, Officer Cole," he drawled, voice rough. "Heard you've been babysitting my runners." Ethan leveled his weapon. "Put the bag down, Hank." "Not tonight." Hank swung the duffel across his shoulder and drew a revolver. The gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space. Sparks flew as bullets struck metal. Ethan ducked behind a crate, returning fire. Valor barked and darted sideways, circling behind Hank's flank. The man turned, firing once. The bullet grazed Ethan's shoulder, spinning him back. Pain flared white-hot, but he held his aim steady. "Valor, now!" The dog leapt, knocking Hank to the ground. The gun skittered away, and Knox moved in to secure him. Within minutes, the room filled with officers. The duffel bag spilled open, packets of powder and stacks of cash. Knox kicked one aside. "Looks like your hunch paid off." Ethan pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder. "We'll see. This operation's too big for just him." By dawn, the snow had stopped. Red Hank was in custody, the warehouse sealed. Ethan sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a bandage wrapped tight across his shoulder. Sergeant Briggs stood nearby, clipboard in hand, her expression half relieved, half concerned. "You were lucky," she said. "Half an inch deeper, and we'd be telling stories at your memorial." Ethan smirked faintly. "I'll try not to ruin your paperwork." Valor sat at his feet, head resting on Ethan's knee. A paramedic, Tom Alvarez, a stocky man in his 50s with a graying beard and a heart too big for his own good, handed Valor a small piece of jerky. "Brave fella," he said. Most men wouldn't run into gunfire like that. Ethan looked down at the dog. He doesn't know how to do anything else. When the reports were finished and the suspects loaded into vans, Ethan returned home to find Sophie waiting by the window, her small face pale with worry. Mrs. Givens had stayed the night with the children. She stood behind Sophie, her hands on the girl's shoulders. "You're late, officer," the older woman said, voice trembling slightly. "They said there was shooting." Ethan knelt to meet Sophie's gaze. "I'm fine, sweetheart. We got the bad guys." Sophie threw her arms around his neck, whispering, "I prayed you'd come back." He hugged her gently, feeling her heartbeat thrum against his chest. "Guess someone up there was listening," he murmured. As night fell again, Ethan sat by the fire with his arm in a sling. Sophie colored quietly at the table while Noah slept nearby, his small breath steady. Valor lay stretched beside the hearth, eyes half closed but alert. On the mantel, the photo of Ethan and Grace seemed to glow in the flickering light. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't look away from it. He just sat there, letting the warmth fill the silence. The storm outside had passed, but inside his chest, something new had begun to stir. The fragile peace that comes only after keeping a promise. The snow outside had hardened into a white crust, the world glittering beneath a pale morning sun. Maple Hollow looked peaceful again, but Ethan Cole had learned that peace in this town never lasted long. He stood on the porch of his cabin, arms still stiff in a sling from the gunshot he'd taken during the raid. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, yet it felt cleaner than it had in weeks. Valor stood beside him, alert as always, his fur brushed and gleaming, a proud streak of black down his back. Sophie's laughter floated faintly from inside the house, high, bright, alive. She was helping Mrs. Givens bake muffins again. The smell of butter and cinnamon drifted into the cold. For a moment, Ethan let himself breathe in that peace. Then his phone buzzed. The screen read, "Knox." Ethan answered. "You're up early." "I'd say the same to you," Knox replied, voice rough with exhaustion. "Listen, Red Hank's talking, but only enough to make trouble. He says there's someone inside our department who's been feeding him information. Someone high up." Ethan frowned. "You believe him?" "I didn't," Knox said, "until one of the evidence crates from the warehouse went missing last night." Ethan's pulse quickened. "That's internal." "Exactly. I'm heading back to the station. Keep your head low." When the call ended, Ethan stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he looked down at Valor. "You hear that, boy? We're not done yet." The dog tilted his head, amber eyes sharp. By noon, clouds rolled back over the mountains, dragging the light away. Sophie and Noah were coloring at the table when Ethan walked in, pulling on his jacket. Sophie looked up, worry already flickering in her eyes. "You're going out again?" "Just to town," he said. "Shouldn't be long." Mrs. Givens, flour dusting her sleeves, frowned. "You need rest, Ethan. You're stitched together like a quilt already." He smiled faintly. "Just checking on something. Valor's coming with me." Mrs. Givens sighed but didn't argue. "Then at least come back before supper. The kids worry." Ethan nodded and left, the door creaking shut behind him. The drive into town was quiet, the radio off, the road glistening with meltwater. Snowmelt dripped from rooftops in slow rhythm. Valor sat upright in the passenger seat, ears twitching. Ethan's thoughts spun with the possibilities. Someone inside the department leaking information, the stolen evidence, Red Hank's smirk when he'd said, "You can't stop what's already inside." He parked behind the precinct, where the lot was nearly empty. Inside, the air felt tense. Officers spoke in low tones, their glances sharp and uncertain. Knox was in the records room, hunched over a stack of files. His tie was crooked, his eyes bloodshot. "I checked the inventory twice," he said when Ethan entered. "Box 14C, missing. The drugs from the Hank bust, gone without a trace. Security cameras? Offline between midnight and 2. System malfunction." Knox scoffed. "Convenient, right?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who was on duty?" Knox hesitated. "Sergeant Briggs." Ethan blinked. "Laura?" Knox shrugged. "Could be coincidence, but she signed the access log at 12:07, said she was reviewing evidence. No one saw her leave." Ethan rubbed his temple, torn between instinct and disbelief. Briggs had always been meticulous, honest to the bone, or so he'd thought. You think she's dirty? Knox leaned back. I think she's scared. Maybe someone's got leverage. Before Ethan could answer, Valor's ears shot up. The dog let out a low growl, staring toward the hallway. Seconds later, a muffled boom shook the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling. What the hell? Knox shouted. Ethan was already running, Valor at his side. Smoke poured from the evidence wing, thick and acrid. Alarms wailed through the building. Fire! Someone screamed. Officers scrambled for extinguishers, shouting names. Ethan covered his mouth and pushed through the haze toward the source. Flames licked along the ceiling tiles, spreading fast. The storage room door hung open, its steel edges blackened. Inside, shelves of case files curled and burned, and there, near the back, a figure moved through the smoke. Stop! Ethan shouted, drawing his gun, but the person bolted through the emergency exit. Valor lunged forward, and they gave chase into the snow-covered alley behind the building. The smoke trailed after them like a ghost. The suspect stumbled on the ice. Glancing back once, Ethan caught a glimpse of auburn hair under the hood. Briggs. His stomach twisted. Laura, don't run. She turned the corner, coughing, panic blazing in her eyes. You don't understand, she cried. They said they'd kill my brother if I didn't. A gunshot cut through her words. She froze mid-step, shock flashing across her face before she collapsed into the snow. Ethan spun toward the sound. Someone stood on the far roof, rifle in hand. A man in a dark coat, face obscured by a mask. He fired again. The bullet shattered brick near Ethan's head. Down! Ethan shouted. Valor leapt between him and the shot, barking furiously. The sniper retreated into the blizzard as sirens wailed closer. Ethan dropped to Briggs's side, pressing a hand against her wound. Blood seeped hot through his gloves. Stay with me, he urged, her breathing hitched. Locker 23. Proof, she whispered. Then her eyes glazed, the light fading. Knox appeared seconds later, coughing through the smoke. Ethan, what happened? She was working with them, Ethan said quietly, but not willingly. He looked at the burning building. Someone inside's cleaning house. By the time firefighters doused the flames, half the evidence wing was destroyed. That night, the precinct was sealed off, and federal agents arrived to take control. Ethan sat in the back of an ambulance again, his shoulder throbbing from the strain. Knox stood nearby, hands buried in his pockets, watching the chaos unfold. We're in deep now, he muttered. Ethan didn't reply. His gaze was fixed on Valor, who sat obediently by his side, nose streaked with ash, but eyes clear and steady. The dog nudged Ethan's arm gently, as if to remind him, stay grounded, stay alive. Hours later, back at the cabin, Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. Sophie was asleep on the couch with Noah nestled against her, the fire casting soft light over their faces. They looked so peaceful that for a moment, the night's violence felt unreal. He turned toward Valor, who rested near the door. We're running out of time, Ethan murmured. Whatever's inside this town, it's not just a drug ring anymore. Valor's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and steady, an unspoken promise that he wasn't facing it alone. Ethan exhaled, glancing at the children again. The world could burn, but for now, in this small circle of warmth and breath, life still held. And that was reason enough to fight. The snow began to melt across Maple Hollow, leaving the streets damp and shining beneath a sky the color of pewter. Days had passed since the fire at the precinct. The town was quiet, but tension hummed beneath that quiet like an unseen current. Ethan Cole sat on the back porch of his cabin, his injured arm resting in a sling, watching the trees sway in the pale afternoon light. Valor lay beside him, muzzle on his paws, amber eyes half closed, but alert as always. The rhythm of Sophie's laughter drifted from the yard, where she and Noah built something resembling a snow fort with what little snow remained. Every so often, Sophie would peek over her shoulder to make sure Ethan was still watching, and every time, he nodded, smiling faintly. Peace was fragile, he knew, and it never lasted long in his world. But for now, this little moment belonged to them. Inside, Mrs. Given stirred soup on the stove, humming softly to an old gospel tune. She had become part of their strange new family, stubborn but warm-hearted, a guardian of sorts who had taken to checking on the children daily, just to make sure the officer doesn't feed them cereal for dinner. When Ethan walked in, she gave him her usual scolding look. "You're supposed to be resting that arm, not brooding out there like a storm cloud." He chuckled softly. "If I rest anymore, I'll turn to rust." "Then at least rust somewhere near a blanket," she said, handing him a steaming bowl. "And for heaven's sake, don't think you're fooling anyone. I can tell when you've got something brewing behind those eyes." She wasn't wrong. The fire, the missing evidence, Sergeant Briggs's final words, Locker 23, proof, all gnawed at him constantly. He had checked every report, but federal agents had sealed the crime scene. Something in him refused to let it go. That evening, Knox stopped by. He looked worse than usual, coat unbuttoned, face shadowed by stubble, a flask half hidden in his jacket. "You look like hell," Ethan said, opening the door. Knox smirked. "You should see the other guy." Then, more seriously, "I've been thinking about Briggs, about what she said before she died." Ethan motioned him inside. Sophie and Noah had already gone to bed, their small breath steady in the next room. The two men sat at the kitchen table while Valor dozed near the fire. "Locker 23, Ethan said quietly. "You think she meant here? At the precinct?" Knox shook his head. "No, federal guys swept it clean, but Briggs had a storage unit off County Road 9. Guess what number it was?" Ethan's pulse jumped. 23. Knox nodded. "I got the address, but they'll have eyes on it. If we move quiet." Mrs. Givens, pretending to fuss with dishes in the sink, turned slightly. "You boys planning to get yourselves killed again?" Knox smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." Ethan met her gaze. "We'll be careful." But she saw it in his eyes, the same haunted determination she'd seen in soldiers years ago when her husband was still alive. She didn't argue. She just crossed herself quietly as they left. They drove through the sleeping town, headlights slicing through fog. The road wound out toward the old lumber district, where rusted warehouses leaned like forgotten bones. The storage facility sat at the edge of the forest, chain-link fence rattling in the wind. A tired-looking clerk inside the small office nodded drowsily as Ethan flashed his badge. "Unit 23?" Ethan asked. The clerk yawned. "Far end, last row." The lock clicked open easily, too easily. Inside, the unit was cold, the air thick with dust. Rows of old file boxes filled the narrow space. Ethan knelt, flashlight sweeping over labels. Police reports, surveillance logs, and, his beam froze, photographs of Red Hank with several men in uniform. One of them was Captain Reed Dalton, head of Maple Hollow PD. Knox swore under his breath. "He's the leak!" Before Ethan could reply, Valor stiffened, ears pricked. Then, outside, headlights flared through the slats. A black SUV rolled to a stop near the gate. "Move!" Ethan hissed. They grabbed the folders and slipped out the back, cutting through the trees. Bullets shattered glass behind them. Valor barked sharply, leading the way through the snow-dusted undergrowth. They reached the riverbank just as the SUV's doors slammed. Flashlights swept the woods. Knox ducked behind a fallen log, breath ragged. "They knew we'd come." Ethan crouched beside him, pressing the folder under his jacket. "We need to split up. Take the truck, drive back through the ridge. I'll circle with Valor." "Not a chance." "Do it," Ethan said firmly. "If they catch us both, it's over." Knox hesitated, then nodded, eyes fierce. "Don't die, Cole." Ethan gave a grim smile. "I'll do my best." When the lights drew closer, he signaled Valor. The dog darted ahead, leading them into the thick of the pines, snow crunching underfoot. The chase stretched across the dark woods, adrenaline pounding through his veins. When they finally reached the frozen creek that bordered his property, Ethan stopped to catch his breath. Valor stood beside him, panting, steam rising from his fur. Back at the cabin, dawn crept over the trees. Ethan spread the documents across the table, scanning the evidence under lamplight. Dalton's signature was everywhere. Wire transfers, case redactions, even the requisition forms for seized narcotics. Briggs had risked everything to uncover it. Mrs. Givens entered quietly, robe wrapped tight around her. "You didn't sleep," she said. Couldn't. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then make sure all this, she gestured at the papers, means something. Don't let her die for nothing. Ethan looked up at her, the weight of it all pressing on his chest. I won't. Later that morning, Sophie padded into the kitchen, hair tousled from sleep. You're up early, she mumbled. Ethan smiled softly. Couldn't let you steal all the muffins? She giggled, rubbing her eyes. Can we go outside later? Valor likes when I throw snowballs. He nodded. We'll go after breakfast. As she poured cereal, she glanced at the document spread nearby, curiosity flickering. Is that your work? Yeah, he said quietly. Just trying to make things right. Sophie didn't fully understand, but she smiled anyway. You already did. You made us a home. Her words struck deeper than she could know. Ethan reached out, brushing her hair back gently. That's the best thing I've ever done, he said. Outside, the morning was soft and bright. Sophie ran ahead, laughing as Valor bounded after her through the melting snow. For the first time in weeks, Ethan allowed himself a real smile. There was still danger ahead, but the light had returned, fragile, yes, but enough to guide him forward. And for a man who had once lost everything, that was enough. The wind carried the first hints of spring through Maple Hollow. Snowmelt streamed down the gutters, filling the ditches with glistening water, and the scent of thawed earth rose from the fields beyond town. Inside Ethan Cole's cabin, the fire had burned down to warm embers. Morning light filtered through the curtains, painting the room in gold. Sophie sat at the table, humming softly as she drew. Noah, his cheeks pink and healthy again, babbled beside her while Valor sprawled near the doorway, one paw twitching in dreamlike contentment. Ethan had barely slept. The documents they'd taken from Briggs's locker were now hidden in a locked drawer beneath his desk. He'd already made copies, stored carefully under floorboards near the porch. Precautions that had become instinct after years on the force. The papers were a time bomb, proof that Captain Reed Dalton, the man who had sworn to protect Maple Hollow, was the one selling it piece by piece to organized crime. A knock sounded at the door. Ethan's body tensed. Valor lifted his head, ears pricked, but his tail wagged faintly. No threat. When Ethan opened the door, he found Martha Klein, a federal agent sent from the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division. She was in her 40s, tall, with dark skin, close-cropped hair, and an expression carved from equal parts discipline and exhaustion. Her black coat was flecked with melted snow. Officer Cole, she said, flashing her badge. Agent Klein, I'd like a word. Ethan stepped aside. Come in. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the modest warmth of the space, the toys near the couch, Sophie's colored drawings taped on the wall. You've built quite the home here, she said. Not what I expected from your file. Didn't think I could cook? Ethan asked dryly. Klein smiled faintly. Didn't think you'd settle. Her tone softened. We know about Briggs's death. You were right to look into her lead. But this case is bigger than you realize. Dalton has friends in high places, judges, suppliers, even 2 sheriffs across county lines. If we move too soon, the evidence disappears. If we wait too long, so do we. Ethan crossed his arms. So, you want me to stay quiet? I want you to stay alive, Klein said evenly. Let us handle it from here. Valor growled low, sensing his handler's tension. Sophie peeked from the hallway, clutching her brother's hand. Klein noticed them and lowered her voice. You've got something to protect now. That changes how you fight. Ethan didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. After she left, Sophie came into the room, still in her flannel pajamas. Who was that lady? Someone from work, Ethan said softly. She's trying to fix things. Sophie studied his face. Are you in trouble? He knelt beside her, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. No, I just have to be careful for a while. But you don't need to worry. That's my job. That afternoon, Mrs. Gibbons arrived with a basket of freshly baked rolls. Her scarf fluttered like a flag in the soft wind. I hear trouble follows you like a stray cat, officer, she said with mock sternness. So I brought carbs. They fix everything. Sophie laughed, racing to hug her. You should move in, Mrs. Gibbons. The old woman chuckled, setting down the basket. Tempting, dear, but if I did, who'd scold the mayor for his potholes? Ethan smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. For a few hours, the cabin felt like something he hadn't known in years. Normal. As twilight approached, Knox called. His voice was low, urgent. "Cole, we've got a problem. The Bureau's transport carrying Dalton's backup ledgers was hit on the highway. 2 agents dead." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Dalton? Probably. He's cleaning up loose ends. You're one of them." Ethan glanced at Sophie and Noah, who were laughing by the fireplace with Valor. "Then he'll have to go through me first." Knox exhaled through static. "I knew you'd say that. Meet me tomorrow at the North Overlook. Bring the files." When the call ended, Ethan turned off the lights, standing in the soft glow of the fire. Valor stood beside him, tail still, muscles tense. The dog sensed his unease like a shadow he couldn't chase. Ethan crouched, pressing a hand to Valor's fur. "If anything happens to me, you stay with them. You hear me?" Valor's eyes met his, a quiet understanding passing between them. That night, as the storm clouds gathered again, Sophie woke to find Ethan sitting by the window, staring out at the dark tree line. "Can't sleep?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "Not tonight." She walked over, clutching her blanket. "When my mom couldn't sleep, she'd tell me stories," Sophie whispered, "about angels who guard people even when they're scared." Ethan smiled faintly. "Sounds like your mom was a smart woman." "She said sometimes angels look like people," Sophie said sleepily, "but sometimes they're dogs." She looked at Valor, who raised his head at the sound of his name. "I think he's one." Ethan chuckled softly, voice rough. "You might be right." By morning, the snow had returned, soft and relentless. Ethan loaded his truck with the copies of the documents, tucking them under the seat. Sophie stood on the porch in her coat, Noah bundled in her arms. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Just to meet someone," he said, zipping his jacket. "I'll be back before lunch." Valor jumped into the passenger seat, tail wagging once before settling. As Ethan pulled away, Sophie called after him, her small voice breaking through the wind. "Be careful." He raised a hand in answer, but didn't look back. At the Overlook, Knox waited in his sedan, engine, idling. The sky was steel gray, the valley below veiled in mist. "You have the files?" he asked as Ethan approached. Ethan nodded. "In the truck." Knox sighed, looking older than his years. "I keep thinking about Briggs, about what we owe her." Before Ethan could respond, Valor's ears snapped forward, a growl rumbling in his chest. Then, a gunshot. The windshield of Knox's car exploded in a spray of glass. "Ambush!" Ethan shouted, diving for cover. Bullets tore through the air, striking the snow in sharp bursts. 2 black SUVs appeared from the tree line, doors flying open. Men in tactical black advanced fast. Knox fired back, ducking behind the car. "They found us!" Ethan crawled toward the truck, unholstering his weapon. Valor sprinted through the snow, barking fiercely, darting between gunfire with precision. He lunged at one of the attackers, knocking the rifle from his hands. Ethan's blood burned with adrenaline, his mind on one thought only: keep them away from the files. After several minutes that felt like hours, the forest fell silent, except for the hiss of falling snow. The men retreated, tires spinning as they sped away. Knox collapsed beside the car, panting. "You good?" Ethan nodded, chest heaving. "Barely." Valor returned, limping slightly but unharmed. Ethan knelt, brushing the snow from the dog's fur. "You're a damn hero," he whispered. Valor licked his hand in reply. When they returned home, Sophie ran into his arms. "You're okay!" she cried, tears streaking down her cheeks. Ethan held her close, the smell of her hair grounding him in the moment. "I'm okay," he said softly. "We're all okay." Later, after the children slept, Ethan sat beside the fire, Valor's head resting on his knee. Outside, the snow fell steady and soft, blanketing the scars of the world in white. He looked around, the drawings on the wall, the faint sound of Noah's breathing, the rhythm of Sophie's dreams, and realized that amid all the chaos, something unshakable had taken root here. Not just safety, not just duty, but home. And for Ethan Cole, that meant everything. Morning broke clear over Maple Hollow. the sky an impossible blue after nights of gray storms. The snow was nearly gone, reduced to glittering patches across the hills. Smoke rose in thin curls from Ethan Cole's chimney, and the sound of laughter drifted faintly through the pines. Inside the cabin, warmth and life mingled in the air, the crackle of firewood, the scent of coffee, and the rhythm of Sophie's giggles as she tried to feed oatmeal to a squirming Noah. Valor sat nearby, alert and noble, his golden-brown fur gleaming in the sunlight that poured through the window. His left paw still bore a small scar from the ambush, but he carried it like a badge of honor. Ethan watched the scene quietly from the kitchen doorway. His sling was finally gone, the bullet wound healed to a faint ache. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to patrol, answering calls, or chasing shadows. For once, life had slowed enough for him to remember what peace felt like. Yet even as he smiled, his mind couldn't rest. Dalton was still out there, wounded but dangerous, the Bureau's manhunt slowed by bureaucracy. Evil, he'd learned, didn't vanish. It waited. That morning, Knox came by, looking weary but determined. His car was dusted with salt from the thawing roads. "You look like a man who actually slept," he said, stepping inside. "Almost didn't recognize you." Ethan poured him coffee. "You're still breathing, so I must be doing something right." Knox took the mug with a smirk. "Word is, Dalton's trying to leave the state. FBI's tracking wire transfers. He's moving cash through fake charities." Ethan frowned. "He'll try to disappear." "Or burn everything before he goes," Knox said. "You and those kids are still on his radar." Ethan glanced at the window, where Sophie was now outside with Valor, throwing sticks near the fence line. "He comes near them. I'll end it myself." Knox studied him for a moment. "I know you mean that, but let's do it the right way." The right way. The words rang hollow. For months, Ethan had lived by rules, but now those rules felt thin compared to the promise he'd made to Sophie that night in the snow. "You're safe now." He intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. That afternoon, he received a call from Agent Klein. Her tone was clipped but calm. "We found him. Dalton's holed up at his lake house north of the ridge. He's alone, wounded. We move tonight." "I'm coming," Ethan said before she could object. Klein hesitated. "It's not a request for help, Cole. It's an operation." "Then I'm part of it," he replied. He made this personal the second he burned Briggs alive. A pause, then quietly, "Be ready at 1900. When night fell, the storm had returned, this time a soft curtain of snow that made the world glow silver under the moonlight. The Bureau's convoy rumbled. Along the back roads in silence, 3 SUVs, black and unmarked. Ethan rode in the second, Valor sitting upright beside him in his harness. The dog's breath fogged the glass as they neared the frozen lake. Ahead, the dark silhouette of Dalton's lodge stood against the slope, lights burning through the storm. Agent Klein briefed them quickly. "He's armed. Surveillance shows motion inside, but no backup. We take him alive, if possible." Ethan loaded his sidearm, jaw tight. "If possible," he repeated softly. They moved in quiet formation. The air was sharp with cold and tension. Valor padded low to the ground, muscles coiled. Ethan could feel his heartbeat sync with the dog's steady rhythm. Man and animal breathing as one. At the front steps, Klein signaled. The door burst open with a crack. Inside, the air was thick with gun oil and smoke. Dalton stood near the fireplace, revolver in hand, blood seeping from a wound in his side. His once pristine uniform jacket was gone, replaced by a flannel shirt and madness in his eyes. "Took you long enough," he rasped. "Drop it, Reed," Klein ordered. He laughed hoarsely. "You think you're heroes? You think Maple Hollow's clean because of you? You'll never stop what's built on greed and fear." Ethan stepped forward slowly, gun steady. "You built it. Now you can end it." Dalton's gaze flicked to him, hatred flashing. "You," he spat. "You were supposed to die in that warehouse. You ruined everything." He raised the gun. The shot never came. Valor lunged from the side, knocking Dalton backward. The revolver discharged, the bullet shattering glass instead of flesh. The two figures crashed into the table. Ethan rushed forward, cuffing Dalton's wrist as Klein and her agents swarmed. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. When it was over, Dalton sat cuffed against the wall, panting, defeated. "You think this matters?" he hissed. "There'll always be another me." Ethan looked down at him, eyes cold. "Maybe, but not in my town." Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the blood and footprints, cleansing the ground in silence. By dawn, the ordeal was over. Dalton was taken away in an armored vehicle, and the Bureau began dismantling his network across the state. Ethan stood on the ridge with Klein, watching the sun rise. She rubbed her gloved hands together. "You did good, Cole. Not many men would have risked what you did." He smiled faintly. "Didn't do it for glory." Klein nodded, understanding. "Those kids, they changed you?" Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the first light touched the snow. "They reminded me why I joined in the first place." When he returned home later that morning, the cabin was alive with the smell of pancakes and laughter. Sophie ran to the door, nearly tripping over Valor, who barked joyfully at the sight of Ethan. "You're back!" she cried. "I told Noah you would be." Ethan knelt to hug her, his voice rough with warmth. "Told you I'd keep my promise." Mrs. Givens appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron with flour on her cheek. "You missed breakfast, officer, but there's coffee. Strong, the way you like it." Ethan smiled, hanging up his coat. "Coffee sounds perfect." Hours later, when the children were napping, he sat by the window with his mug, watching sunlight spill across the melting fields. Valor lay beside him, eyes half closed, chest rising in steady rhythm. Ethan reached down, scratching the dog behind the ears. "We made it, boy," he said softly. "For once, we really made it." Outside, a pair of cardinals darted between the bare trees, flashes of red against white. Sophie's drawing hung on the wall nearby, the one she'd made months ago. A man, a girl, a baby, and a German shepherd, standing under a snowy sky. She had written one word beneath it in her uneven handwriting. Home. Ethan smiled, leaning back in his chair as the fire cracked softly. For the first time in a long while, there were no sirens in his mind, no ghosts in his heart. Just peace. Just family. And as snowflakes drifted gently past the window, Officer Ethan Cole closed his eyes and whispered the words that had guided him through every storm. "A promise kept is a life redeemed." Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. They come quietly, through the warmth of a home once cold, through laughter after pain, through the love that grows when broken hearts dare to open again. Ethan thought he was rescuing 2 lost children, but in truth, God sent those children to rescue him. Every sunrise is a reminder that no storm lasts forever, and every act of kindness is proof that heaven still works through human hands. Like Ethan, we are called to protect, to love, to keep our promises, not because we are perfect, but because God's grace gives us the strength to try again each day. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to thank the Lord for the unseen miracles in your life. Share this story so others can feel His presence in their struggles. Comment below where you're watching from, and write Amen if you believe that faith, kindness, and love can still change the world. May God bless you and your family, fill your days with peace, and remind you that every good deed is part of His divine plan. And remember, miracles still happen, especially when we choose to become one for